Welcome everyone and good afternoon. Welcome to today's ParaBoss webinar. ParaBoss is Australia's resource for control of worms, lice, flies and ticks, and is a joint initiative of Australian Wool Innovation, Meat and Livestock Australia, the University of New England and Animal Health Australia. Today is the first of our webinars since ParaBoss is undergoing an upgrade and relaunch. So we're very excited to have you all here today, and we will be talking about controlling bush ticks and theileriosis in Australian cattle, and our presenter will be Dr. Matt Playford. Today you have myself, Fiona MacArthur, on screen, and you will also have Megan Rogers, who you can see in the background, who will be there helping us out behind the scenes today, doing some poll questions and answering any questions you have through the chat function, which we'll go through in a minute. So welcome, Megan. Thanks for joining us today. It's great to have you on board, and we'll meet Matt shortly. About Matt. Matt grew up in Cowra, which, if for those of you who are from overseas or interstate, is from the Central Tablelands in New South Wales. After extensive travel and study, which is no underestimation, Matt truly has just about been everywhere. He's been a veterinary consultant for 17 years and also the director of Dorbuts Proprietary Limited, a company that runs a parasitology laboratory and conducts research on behalf of the livestock industries. Matt is also our technical lead here at the extension team for ParaBoss, so it is fabulous to have his expertise here with you all today. Welcome, Matt. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Fiona. Just give me the thumbs up if you can hear me okay there.
Yes, great. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for your kind introduction. I'll just move on to the actual subject at hand, bush ticks and theileriosis, and particularly what we can do to control their effects. And when we talk about theileriosis, we have to bear in mind that there are a couple of different types of theileriosis around the world. And in particular, we've got this nasty one in East Africa. It's actually called East Coast fever, that's caused by Theileria parva. And we know that each year it's estimated that about 1 million head of cattle are killed by this particular disease. So in world terms, this is one of the nastiest diseases of cattle around the world. The other type of Theileria that causes major problems is this one called Theileria annulata. And you can see it's located in North Africa, Central Asia, and right through the big cattle areas of India, Pakistan, the Middle East, and even into southern Europe. Now that's terrible because it causes major disease, and there's about 240 million head of cattle there right through to northern China. But these ones are exotic diseases. They don't occur in Australia. What we're most interested in is this one, which used to be called Theileria sargentii, and it spread from Japan into Australia maybe 100 years ago, and then it's now had a change of name to Theileria orientalis. So this is the one we're talking about now, and being sharing, caring type of people, we've actually shared it across the ditch to our good friends in New Zealand. So this is what we're talking about today, Theileria orientalis, and it's an infection spread by bush ticks, and it's very, very different from the Theilerias found in Africa and in Asia, but almost the same as the one found in Japan. Well, let's look at what it does, and probably the best way to do that is to look at a case study. Now, this is in a northern Victorian beef farm. I know they don't look like beef cattle, and that's because this farm decided to convert to dairy. They went and bought in a lot of cattle from all over the place, including from Gippsland, northern Victoria, coastal New South Wales. Now, because of the particular circumstances on this farm, disease started to hit within a few months, and particularly seen in cattle on the point of calving. They started to have abortions, they went down weakness and death, and over the next 6 months, they had 80 abortions, 30 had died, 100 had chronic illness. Now, the type of things they were seeing were metritis, infection in the reproductive tract, mastitis, and just cows that never did well after they got infected. Now, this isn't the only case where this happened. This is in about the early parts of last decade, so in about 2011, 2012. There were multiple cases of this happening, not just in northern Victoria, but all over the country. When the disease actually hit Victoria, it seemed to move in a wave from the north to the south. And if you look at this little diagram that was very kindly put together by Professor Grant Rawlin of the Victorian DPI, you can see that it actually moved from the northern region up in the Murray Valley and then down into central Victoria and across to Gippsland. Not many cases in the Western districts, thankfully, and that may have something to do with the distribution of the bush tick. When we look at the economics, the big MLA study in 2015 estimated that the national cost for about $18 million, almost all in lost production. However, on individual farms, they can be absolutely disastrous. And so you can imagine that previous case study that we had estimated they lost close to $1 million. And there were many other outbreaks where the losses were estimated at over $100,000. Now, this is all caused by ticks biting cattle. So let's have a look at the actual tick. You can see we're talking about a tick that's quite small. If you have one on your finger, you'd almost not even notice it. And for much of the year, these ticks are very small. In fact, the larval ticks are less than 1 millimetre in size. Even when they're nymphs, they only get to about 1.3 millimetres. And then the adults climb onto the cattle when they're 3 millimetres long. And even when they're fully engorged, they're only 8 millimetres long. Now, the time that they're actually visible and large is only a very small part of their life cycle. And so if you see these on cattle, you're actually very, very lucky, because most of the time they're almost invisible. They're so small that people don't see them. The time taken to engorge is only 6 days. And so if you actually see a big fat one, you know that there's a lot more either in the environment or just small ones crawling around on the cattle. A couple of features of this particular tick. The first one is the legs are this browny, sort of reddy brown colour. And the other one is the first pair of legs are very close to the head. And that's one good way of distinguishing this tick from other ticks. Look at some of its other features. It's a 3-host tick. They attach to any mammal, including wildlife, and in New Zealand they've even found them on kiwis, so they will actually attach to birds as well. And when we say any mammal, that includes humans. So if these ticks get on you, they will attach and they'll feed. They will overwinter, and so they spend a long time in the environment. And the normal pattern of disease is that they emerge in the spring and attach to cattle. Now, here's a technical note for the parasitologist. The Theileria, which these ticks carry, is transstadial, which means it's quite happily transferred from one stage of the tick to the other, but it doesn't infect the ovaries, and therefore it doesn't get transferred from the tick to the eggs. More about that later. Okay, well, the first thing is, how do we distinguish a bush tick from a cattle tick and a paralysis tick? Because they often occur in the same areas, particularly in Queensland and northern New South Wales. You may see cattle ticks on your cattle. And the cattle ticks, the dominant feature is the legs, which are the first pair is quite a distance away from the head, whereas with the bush tick, as you can see in the middle, and I'll just highlight that with my marker, the first pair of legs are very close to the head. Paralysis tick also like that, but it's quite distinguishable by being a different colour. What's the distribution of the bush tick? Well, this is the rough distribution, and it means that we're not really sure exactly where these ticks occur. But you could say, if you can hear a kookaburra, you can probably see a bush tick somewhere, because the distribution of the kookaburra is very similar, right up to Cape York, all the way down the east coast into Victoria, particularly the eastern half of Victoria. And then there's a patch there in Western Australia. Now we have to give credit to the very diligent researchers over in Albany, who have done a big survey in Western Australia, both for the bush tick and for the Theileria parasites that they carry. But in Western Australia, you might like to think of them being more closely associated with the numbat habitat. So if you've ever been out looking for numbats, and I know they're quite rare these days, the bush tick seems to favour the same type of conditions that the numbats like. The rest of Australia, it's like kookaburras, except I know there's kookaburras in Tasmania and Western Victoria, but the ticks don't seem to like it down there yet. We have to also acknowledge that these are an invasive species, and they have spread into Australia and other countries from where they were originally located in Asia, so they could spread even further. This question, have you ever seen bush ticks on your cattle? So if you go to the chat box and put in your answer, I'll get Fiona and Megan to monitor that and see if we've got any people who've seen bush ticks on their cattle. I can see a few answers coming in there, so thanks everyone for giving us your answers. Okay, well look, yep, no, still some people, no, yes.
Looks like about a 50-50 spread there, Matt, I think, just having a quick scroll through.
Okay, and any comments that we can take out of that? Any insights, Fiona?
Oh, an interesting one. No, they haven't on their cattle, but yes, on native animals. That's it there, Matt.
Okay, great. Well, look, let's move on and look at the life cycle in detail. And that's because we're looking at a very particular life cycle here that's different from the life cycle of your cattle ticks. So when we talk about bush ticks, the first thing that we really need to remember is it's a three-host tick. And three-host ticks spend a lot of time in the environment, either on native animals or ferals like deer, but they can even quite happily live on horses or dogs. So that's the first thing to remember. There are three-host ticks, so you don't just see them on cattle. It also means that the feral animals like deer, for example, which tend to roam fairly widely, can transfer them from one region to another or one farm to another. So just because you've set up your own farm very well, even with fences, you could have an intrusion from outside. The second key feature of the life cycle is that these ticks undergo parthenogenesis. And what we mean by that is that if you actually collected 400 or 500 of these ticks and had a look at them, you find that almost all of them are females. It's very difficult to find a male in a wild population of ticks. Now, this gives us a clue as to their origins, because it's also true of the bush ticks that they find in northern Japan. However, the bush ticks in southern Japan have a lot of males as well, and so they have normal life cycle and reproduction. Now, does that mean that the 1 in 400 males that you find are actually very active? No, they don't need to be. They can relax because the females take care of the entire life cycle on their own, and they don't need males to introduce. The third thing is the distribution. Now, we suspect, or we strongly suspect, that these ticks came from Japan, but they've been in Australia for probably about 120 years because they were identified a long time ago in Australia. More recently, they've spread to America, and they were only first discovered about 10 years ago in America. And in America, of course, they're very vigilant about ticks because they've got Lyme disease, borreliosis, in humans. And so they spend a lot of time studying the distribution of the various ticks. And now they've found that these Haemaphysalis ticks have spread to about 13 states, right halfway across America from their original point of entry in the eastern seaboard. And the final thing I just wanted to mention about these ticks is that they can spread other diseases. And if you go to China, Korea, or even in parts of Japan, there is a disease called severe fever with thrombocytopenia syndrome. And that's an infection that affects humans. So people are very cautious about getting these ticks on them in those places. Now, that's a virus that doesn't occur in Australia, so we don't need to be as concerned. But it's a little reminder to us, if you get a tick on yourself, get it off as quick as possible. Okay, well, let's have a look at the life cycle in a bit more detail. At the moment, we tend to see a lot of adults on the ticks, particularly in areas where the ticks have been quiet over the winter. And so at the end of summer into autumn, we're seeing adult ticks. They're the large engorged ticks, and they're about 8 millimeters long. Once they engorge, they drop off and they lay hundreds and hundreds of eggs. Now, what I said before about the ticks spreading infection, you can see the yellow dot in the tick on the beast there is an indication that that has infection, and it's actually giving it to that poor beast there. Now, when the tick is fully engorged with blood from the beast, it drops off to lay eggs, but it doesn't transfer the infection, the Theileria infection, into its eggs. Now, the next stage, it may take place in autumn, it may take place in the summer, whenever it's warm. The eggs hatch after about a month and a half up to 3 months, and they hatch into larvae. The larvae are very small, they're only 0.5 millimeter long, and the distinctive feature of the larvae is that they only have 6 legs. Now, that's different from the nymphs and the adults, which have 8 legs, but these larval ticks only have 6 legs. Now, they don't have Theileria when they first hatch, but of course they'll jump on board a beast, and if it's a carrier animal, which is quite common in the endemic areas, it'll pick up Theileria, and once it's had a feed, it'll drop to the ground. Now, when it drops to the ground, it will molt to become a nymph. We have to remember as well that all of these stages will quite happily reproduce on deer or kangaroos or wombats or other animals. Now, the nymphs are the stage that really last a long time in the grass, and they're quite happy to overwinter up to 9 months. But under the right conditions, they'll molt to young adults in as short a time as 3 weeks up to 95 days. The next stage is the dangerous one, because these nymphs then get onto the cattle and they transfer infection. You can see this little diagram showing the infection inside the tick going into the beast. And then they'll drop off and become adults, and the adults will start the life cycle all over again. Now, the adult ticks themselves will survive quite a long time, 8 months on the grass, and the conditions that the adults are subjected to will determine how long they survive. So they like warm, moist conditions, which is one of the reasons why we see them up that eastern seaboard and in areas such as the southwest of WA. Even within those areas, they're very particular about where they like to live. So, for example, if you're in central Queensland, you might not find them in Rockhampton, but you are likely to find them up at Yungala or Maleny or the Atherton tablelands, where the conditions are a bit moister and a bit cooler. Okay, well, that brings us to the next issue, and that is, what about other hosts? Can Theileria be transferred? And we do know that, yes, you can actually take a needle and suck out blood from one animal and give theileriosis to another animal. And also these lice, particularly sucking lice, have been implicated in the transmission of disease. So we better look in a bit more detail at that. Unfortunately, our colleagues at the University of New England, led by Biniam Lecu, have produced some very interesting research showing that tabanid flies, sucking lice, including this one here, the Haemaphysalis, biting flies, including your buffalo flies, and culicoides, which are the little mites or little midges that infest cattle, have all been found to have Theileria inside them. Now, we don't think, however, they're a major part of the life cycle. And the reason is because when you look at the life cycle, and this is actually from the life cycle of one of the related Theilerias, which of course have clonal expansion, which our Theileria doesn't. When the Theileria gets into the gut of the nymph, they become kinetes, which then form these sporoblasts, and they get massive expansion of the infective form that gets injected with the saliva of the tick into the beast. And so if you do mechanical transfer, we don't have this biological vector effect, and so you don't get the massive expansion. So for survival of the infection, we consider the biological host or the biological vector, the bush tick, to be an important part of it. Now, whether this occurs in other types of ticks is still the subject of research, but it's definitely a feature of our bush tick. So that's the critical phase where the sporoblasts form and become these little sporozoites that infect the beast. Okay, how do we diagnose disease in cattle? Well, the best way is using molecular methods, and that's the PCR or polymerase chain reaction. So your vet will take a blood sample and they'll submit that to a lab, and that will identify the MPSP types. Now, just to clarify, MPSP simply refers to proteins on the surface of the stage of the parasite that's in the red blood cell, the major pyroplasm surface protein. And those types are associated with the different strains of Theileria and whether they cause disease or not. Now, if you're wondering how much that costs, at the moment, I just checked the prices for the DPI lab at Menangle in New South Wales, and it's $61 a test. Now, a lot cheaper and simpler way of doing the test is by a blood smear, where you actually see the parasites inside the red blood cells. But it does also require quite a lot of expertise, and it doesn't tell you what type of Theileria they are. And of course, one thing we all use are the clinical signs. When you look at a beast, what do you see? There is also a blood test ELISA, which is used in research but not clinically for diagnostics. So when I'm talking about clinical signs, this is probably one of the most reliable. When we look at a beast and you part the lips of the fanny and look inside, note the colour, you can see that the colour will usually be, in healthy animals, a nice pink colour. And then as the animal loses blood, they become anemic, and that colour turns into, first of all, a pale colour, and then becomes yellow with jaundice due to the destruction of red blood cells. That's because when the Theileria get into the red blood cells, they actually cause destruction of those red blood cells, and the animal will go from being in a normal situation when the red blood cells make up, say, 30 to 40% of their blood. They'll go to a situation where the red blood cells only make up about 10 to 12% of their blood, and then, of course, they need a blood transfusion. Now, when animals have anemia and very low blood, they have low oxygen carrying capacity, and that means that they can't exercise. And you can see this picture of a vet in New Zealand treating the animal while she's in the paddock, and that's because she's been walking up to the dairy and found that she can't even walk, and so she needs a blood transfusion just to be able to stand up. And that's a feature of outbreaks in Australia as well. As the animal goes from a normal situation where they've got, you know, a healthy pink colour because they've got lots of circulating blood, they go down. As they lose red blood cells, their colour becomes more and more pale. And when they're below 10%, that animal is functioning on a wing and a prayer. It's barely able to sustain life. They breathe in deeply because they're trying to get enough oxygen into their body to sustain them, but they can't walk around. So if you have an animal that you suspect has theileriosis, try as best you can to isolate it using temporary yards or put up some gates and keep it in the paddock rather than trying to walk it anywhere, because that might be what tips it over the edge. Now I'll just pause there because I noticed there's some more chat there, and I'll just go through some of the other answers that we've had. Fiona, if that's okay. And there's one comment there, yes, on the horses, and then someone else has said also on mammals, wallabies and kangaroos, and purposely collect them. They're activated by carbon dioxide of humans walking past. They're easy to catch. And then another person said not seen them. Another person has said saw them in Korea in the 70s. And imported Australian cattle were severely affected by theileriosis. Thanks for that, Professor Bell. What about haired sheep? And another person said, I've seen them on sheep in New Zealand, and that's a feature of infection in New Zealand. They often appear on sheep. I've seen bad local reactions at attachment sites on the non-wool ventral areas of sheep. The mucus discharge in the first picture that showed anemia, well, that's just an incidental finding. Sorry, that's just happened to be when that beast died, it happened to have a bit of mucus there. So that's just incidental, I'm afraid. And then the next one was seeing bush ticks on merino sheep in central New South Wales or central tablelands of New South Wales. Also on my sheep. Are they commonly found on wild birds? So Joe, I don't know, I'm afraid. They could very well be if the birds are sharing habitat with wild mammals in those areas where there's a lot of ticks. I'm sure that they will get on board the birds as well. Well, that brings us to another quiz question, and the quiz question this time is, what's the best treatment for theileriosis in your cattle? If you find theileriosis in your cattle, it's been diagnosed, what is the best treatment? So let's just see if there's any chat or comments. And I've had one comment already. Anyone else willing to offer your suggestions or give us some comments? There may be some vets out there who have treated cattle. I can see a few more comments there. Do you want me to hand over Fiona, and I'll get you to read some of them out?
Absolutely. Tender, loving care.
That's
blood transfusions. It is a great answer. Blood transfusions, very common. Couple coming through for that. Stop milking. Keep them well fed and put them. Try to move them as little as possible and as slowly as possible. Address any trace element deficiencies.
Yep. No, good answers, and I'm very pleased to see that no one's actually reaching for the silver bullet, because the bottom line is there's no specific treatment available. The best thing for these cattle that have got clinical theileriosis, that are actually suffering from theileriosis, is supportive therapy. And that may mean blood transfusions. It may mean electrolyte solutions given intravenously or into the rumen, and treating for nutritional deficiencies, because these animals won't be eating, and they may need supportive nutritional therapy as well. So that's great to hear, and good to know that our vets have got lots of good suggestions there. Okay, well, let's look at the different MPSP types. And we heard before that MPSP simply stands for major pyroplasm surface proteins. They're identified using PCR testing. And the main one we need to know about is Ikeda, which comes from Japan, and it's named after a town in Hokkaido. And even though the disease isn't as common in Hokkaido as it is in southern parts of Japan, this particular strain was first isolated in Ikeda. Chitose is another strain, again named after a town in Hokkaido. And if anyone's flown into Sapporo to go skiing in Japan, that's the name of the airport that you fly into. Now, interestingly, Chitose strain was isolated from Australian cattle back in 1995. These are Australian cattle that were imported into Japan. So that's an indication that we may have had Chitose strain in Australian cattle long before we had Ikeda. Buffalo is a strain we commonly associate with cattle in Queensland, but now, of course, it's found all over the cattle areas of Australia. And that's because the buffalo strain was associated with bush ticks and benign Theileria in Australia, you know, for many, many years. It's been found for decades. In fact, during the 1980s, 1990s, Norm Stewart, Russell Bockbert de Vos, incredible work done at the Tick Fever Institute in Queensland to try and find out what were the details of infection, particularly in Queensland, but also in other places of Australia. Now, there are other types, but they don't seem to cause disease. The ranking there that we've got, number one is Ikeda. If you have Ikeda in your cattle, you can expect to see disease from time to time. Chitose is usually associated with Ikeda, and buffalo is not associated with disease. It's the true benign theileriosis that we've seen in Australia for many years, and will only cause disease under exceptional circumstances. Now, what does this infection look like under the microscope? You can see the red blood cells here, and we've got two major shapes, the long thin ones and the circular ones. And under a smear here, you can see the different types of shapes that we see made from Theileria orientalis. So quite distinct from Babesia or Anaplasma, which are other tick-borne diseases that infect red blood cells. And you can actually distinguish them just under a light microscope. However, the PCR is the gold standard. And if you're going to do any diagnostics, I strongly encourage you to focus on that PCR test. Let's have a look at another case study. This one's from the mid-north coast of New South Wales. Calves, they start to look poor from around 2 months of age. And then when you do blood tests on them, they've got anemia, they've got slow growth rates, high rates of pneumonia. They may even get high rates of coccidiosis, up to 10% mortality rate. And compared to calves that don't have this infection, there's about a 20 kilogram weight difference that's very difficult to make up. So that's another syndrome that we see, where calves growing up in an area where there's high rates of infection tend to get the infection very early on. By the time they're 3 to 4 weeks age, most of them actually have the infection already, and they may get over it quite quickly, and then they develop lifelong immunity, or they may take a while to actually shake it. So nursing your calves through that critical period is an important part of managing theileriosis. So let's look at the top 5 tips for bush tick and theileriosis control. First one is, surprisingly, manage your pastures. Then we're going to look at Ticksides, transporting cattle, monitoring your introduced cattle, and then nutrition and nursing for calves. Now, this is a paddock from southern New South Wales that's going to have very poor survival rates for bush ticks. Now, I'm not suggesting you actually run your cattle in paddocks like this, but the risk of them getting bush ticks and theileriosis is very different to a paddock like this to if they're in a scrubby paddock. So this is one from Western Australia, where cattle are really in a dry light situation, eating most of their feed. There's going to be very little risk of them picking up ticks. And in contrast, in central west of New South Wales, when there's a lot of feed on the ground, any ticks that drop onto this pasture will most likely survive, even though it's not typically a ticky region. So this is outside of the blue line that we consider to be the ticky region, but in a good season, cattle that are brought in with ticks, the ticks drop off and they'll survive and complete their life cycle quite happily, because they've got warm conditions and lots of moisture in that lush green pasture. And then ideal situation for ticks and theileria survival is this place up at Razorback, which is actually my neighbour's place. There's not just lots of pasture, there's lots of native animals hopping around, and there's lots of bush that the native animals come into and go out of. And so that's ideal conditions for sustaining both a large tick population and getting those ticks onto the cattle where they can transmit the theileria. Okay, the second key issue is using Ticksides, or also known as acaricides, on the cattle to try and decrease the amount of ticks and decrease the risk. And I've got 3 different colours here for products that are known to kill bush ticks, products that are often used on cattle for bush ticks, but they don't have a claim, and these products which we know kill bush ticks, but they're not registered for cattle. And that's why they've got the red colour there, because if you use them, you're creating a bit of a risk, both for residues and the safety of the animals. Now let's have a look at them in a bit more detail. The first ones are the synthetic pyrethroids. Now these do a great job at killing bush ticks. And there's a couple of different types, but they're only available in sprays. If you're using a pour-on, then you either can't use it in Australia because it's not registered for use within Australia, or they don't have a claim for ticks. But the sprays and the dips do have a bush tick claim. Now they'll both kill on contact, they're a knockdown, and give up to 10 days protection. They're quite safe to use, both in terms of animal and human safety, and they don't have toxic effects, which you'll find with some other products. So these are probably at the top or near the top of the list for product choice. Now I'll just pause for a moment there because we've got a few more questions. And yep, we've had some research done, and thanks for that. Thanks for those comments there about blood transfusions, again from Professor Bell. And are Bos indicus less prone? No, I can answer your question very clearly, Barbara. Bos indicus cattle are just as susceptible to theileriosis as Bos taurus. And then we've had Bob Suthurst from Queensland visit us. We're able to do a bit of research in Korea. And we've just had them coming into spring, winter pasture, wet, no lengthening the grass. Well, that's good intel. Thank you very much for those comments. And then we've just got another question that's been asked in the Q&A panel. What's the best way to check if a steer or a bull has theileriosis? Good question. You're certainly not looking in their vulva. You're probably looking in their eyes or in their mouth or another place where you can clearly see the mucous membrane. So good point, and thank you for raising that, Rachel. And then David's just commented, any trials I've seen that assess the effect of tick control on the prevalence of Theileria? So none. Are there trials showing otherwise? And that's a good point. And I'm afraid we don't have a definitive answer to that question. Right, the next class of chemical that are used to control bush ticks is Barrage S or Blockade S, and they're a combination of chlorphenvinphos, which is an OP or an organophosphate, and an SP cypermethrin. Now, they do have a knockdown. They're recommended to be used maybe once every 14 days, minimum time in between treatment. But the downside is they do have this signal heading, which is dangerous poison, to indicate that they're a bit more of a hazard to both the human users and to the animals if you don't get the treatment exactly right. And so they wouldn't be your first choice, but they're definitely a good choice for knocking down those bush ticks. And the third one is tactic. This is a bit of a favourite in the tick areas, the cattle tick areas in Queensland, Northern Territory and Western Australia, because it's very good at killing cattle tick, but it will also kill bush ticks. No persistent activity though. So tactic sort of comes and goes, and animals can get infected very shortly after they have been treated. Now, the products that are often used both for cattle tick and other pests are these macrocyclic lactones, such as Cydectin and Dectomax, and I've put this in orange. They don't have a claim for bush tick, so if you're using these to kill bush tick, you're sort of out in the wind a bit. You won't have the assurance that they're going to kill the bush tick as you would with those products that are specifically formulated for bush tick. The other thing is, if you use these too much, then you're selecting for resistance in internal parasites, because every time you use them, of course, you're selecting for internal parasite resistance. Okay, let's look at transport of cattle, and the most susceptible group are what we call naive cattle, cattle that grow up in areas where there's no bush ticks, no theileriosis, and when they are brought into areas where there's bush ticks and theileriosis, they're very susceptible. And so if you're bringing in cattle, you need to be very cautious about introducing them. So even though they're beautiful, healthy cattle, genetically they're excellent, you're unable to actually be assured that they're going to be protected when they're brought into an area that has theileriosis. The opposite occurs when you've got cattle that grow up on the coast, because most of them have been exposed to theileriosis and they'll develop resistance. Now, that doesn't mean that they ever shake the theileriosis though, and if they're brought from the coast out to areas where there's naive cattle, then they pose a risk to those cattle, because they can actually drop ticks on the ground, and those ticks get onto the naive cattle and cause disease. So let's have a bit of a look at how this occurs. Cattle movements are important because you can get ticky to free, free to ticky, and free to free or ticky to ticky. Let's look at a couple of these scenarios. Now, the first one is ticky to free. If you're bringing cattle from a ticky area to a free area, the cattle that you're transporting probably won't get sick from theileriosis, but the cattle at the destination could pick it up. And that's been what's happened historically with those big outbreaks. And that could even happen going into Tasmania. So if you're bringing cattle into Tasmania, you really do want to make sure that they don't have any ticks on them. If you're bringing cattle from a free area to a ticky area, those cattle are very susceptible and they are in high danger. Now, because we don't know exactly where this blue line exists, and it could change depending on season and rainfall, then you have to actually also consider that even these movements from a free to free or ticky to ticky area could actually transfer ticks or could transfer transport susceptible cattle into a place where they're going to come into danger from being infected. And so giving them a good ticicide on introduction will slow the degree of infection that they get, and that'll allow them to have a small infection that probably won't cause disease, but will allow them to develop immunity. And so we sort of rely on the animals becoming accustomed to the Theileria and developing immunity. And the critical times, of course, for infection are when the animal is metabolically challenged, such as late pregnancy, or when they have other metabolic decreased capacity due to nutritional or transport stresses, and they're the ones that are going to be most susceptible. So if you're bringing cattle from drier areas into the coastal area, avoid bringing in pregnant cattle, because that's going to possibly precipitate a big infection, and make sure that you treat them with a good ticicide so that they don't develop high levels of infection. Then they can develop their immunity and become accustomed to the infection before they go through the time of maximum metabolic challenge. Okay, well, that brings us to the next quiz, and I'll reveal the question: what conditions are best for bush ticks? So if you can put your answers into the chat there. What conditions are best for bush ticks? So these are ticks that originally from Asia, they've been transferred to Australia. We've sent them over to New Zealand, and then we sent them the Theileria to go with it. We've had a few answers come in, and it's good to see that people have pretty much got the right answers. I'll just hand over to you, Fiona, to read those answers out.
We have a good common thread coming through, Matt. Wet, warm, long grass, long pastures, scrub country, long grass, moisture and warmth, again, creeks and peaks and damp weather, wet and humid, good pasture cover, nice lush pasture, wildlife, bushlands, more bushlands, some wet lagoons, tussock grasses, so lots of cover and humid conditions, the coast of New South Wales with an exclamation mark, someone's having problems there maybe. And yeah, they're pretty much all moist weather and long grass seems to be a very common thread there, Matt.
Okay, so warm and moist, and appreciate all those comments, because let's face it, I'm still a little bit surprised whenever I hear of new theileriosis outbreaks in some places, because it is extending to new areas all the time, and it's not as predictable as you'd like. There aren't clear-cut tick lines like there are for cattle tick, and so these ticks can spread, particularly in good seasons that are favourable. And let's face it, in Eastern Australia particularly, the last 2 seasons have been very favourable. Warm, moist conditions is what they like. So thank you very much for your answers. Let's move on then, because the other thing we've got to consider, a few people have mentioned sheep, and Kevin Lawrence, who's one of the great researchers of theileriosis in New Zealand at Massey University, has done some studies on the role of sheep in transmission. Look, not definitive studies by any means, but they do show that sheep may have a role in transmission. in New Zealand. In Australia, they haven't really been included in the research so far, but suffice to say that the ticks will definitely get on sheep and the Theileria will survive on sheep. So there's a possibility that if you're running cattle with sheep, they could pick it up from the sheep. But it definitely hasn't been a feature of the mainstream infections so far. And just a little reminder there that if you're in an area where there are a lot of ticks and Theileria, then managing the calves through that critical period, and we're talking about a period probably from 3 weeks of age up to about 4 to 5 months of age, managing them through that when their red blood cells are under attack from the Theileria and they start to develop anemia, they may become sick for simply because they're weak and they're unable to fight off the other infections. And so give them extra nutrition, make sure that they're vaccinated and protected against other diseases, provide them with shelter as necessary, and just manage them as well as you can. Right, well, let's look at the summary. The first one is tick control, particularly in spring and summer, to decrease the risk of ticks and, by extension, the risk of theileriosis. And just in direct response to your question, David, it'd be nice if there were some trials showing that there was a direct correlation. But the advice from the Victorian DPI and other authorities is that tick control is an important part of controlling theileriosis outbreaks, and that's the best advice we have at the moment. The second one is paddock management to reduce the risky habitats, and this has been a big feature of management of the risk in endemic areas of New Zealand and in Japan as well. Less of a focus in Australia. Manage calves carefully during that critical 2 to 6 month age period. So these are all things that are critically important in the areas where there is endemic bush ticks and theileriosis. Now, in areas where there aren't endemic bush ticks and theileriosis, then we're looking at treating all your introductions. Now, they may come from an endemic area, they may not, but we're not really sure where those endemic area limits are. And so treating all your introductions to reduce the risk is sound advice. And then, if you're really concerned, check the farm history and the cattle before sending or bringing in. So if you're concerned about sending theileriosis to someone else or bringing it in from somewhere else, you can always check the cattle and ask about the farm history. Consult your vets both for diagnostics, because they'll be able to do the blood tests, submit them to the diagnostic laboratory, and for biosecurity. And of course, your vet will be able to give you the best advice, not just on theileriosis risk, but on all aspects of biosecurity. So that's the end of the presentation. I can see that there's one more question that's come up, so I'll just tackle that before we move on to the open questions. And the first one is from Ian. The Whitex python tags have a label claim for paralysis ticks, but not bush ticks. And they do get used in an attempt to reduce bush tick numbers and therefore the risk of theileriosis in introduced stock. And so my comment on that is they probably would have an impact, but I can't say for sure, and therefore it's something I'd definitely like to see some trials on. Now, another person has said, is there a vaccine in New Zealand? Not yet. There might be trial vaccines being trialled, as there have been in Australia, but there's no commercial vaccine available yet. Now, I know that some people are limited by time. We've just gone through the allotted time that was set aside, but I'm still available for questions or discussion or insights if anyone wants to pop up any more, either on the chat or onto the Q&A section.
Thanks, Matt. We have dealt with just about all the questions. There is a double up question that's come through. Can sheep suffer from theileriosis? And also adding to that, with the shedding sheep that are moving to coastal areas, what should vets be looking out for?
Yeah, shedding sheep moving to coastal areas will definitely get ticks all over them, and we've heard of this from several places in New South Wales, possibly in other areas as well. But there's no confirmed cases of them getting clinical theileriosis. So they may be getting it, but they're not showing the same signs that cattle do, but they could be involved in the transmission. If you have any cases you'd like to report, please do, because that'd be a very important observation.
Thanks, Matt. Do cows give passive immunity to calves in endemic areas?
No, and we can refer to a couple of different research projects that have particularly looked at calves in Gloucester region and the Dorrigo region, where that doesn't seem to occur, where animals at a young age tend to get infection from the ticks at a quite early age without really any protection. And another question that relates to that: do cows give the infection to calves across the placenta? Look, it has been recorded, but it's very, very rare. So it can happen, but it's not a normal part of the transmission. Normally calves are Theileria free at birth, and they pick up Theileria in those areas with high infection pressure within the first few weeks of life.
Thanks, Matt. A couple more questions have just come through. Hi, Matt, this is from Millie. I found 2 cases down here in the last month. Any ideas out there on survival rates post-blood transfusions?
Oh, look, Millie, I think it's like any severe anemia. If an animal's been staggering around with single-digit PCV, and by that I mean, very, very low red blood cell counts for a couple of days, then they might be on their last legs. But if you catch it early enough, then even raising their PCV by a couple of % has a big impact on their survival rates. And so blood transfusion, and pretty standard in New Zealand during the big outbreaks, was to give between 5 and 10 litres of blood to these cattle. Did have a big impact on survival. So yes, I wish I was able to give you a better clinical information, but it definitely does have an impact. So Fiona, I know there's a couple more. Let's still got a
couple more coming in through the Q&A panel. How quickly do cattle introduced into an area gain some immunity through exposure, Matt?
Yeah, look, great question. And it really depends on the amount of challenge there is in that area. So what we'd really like to see is that cattle introduced into a ticky area have 1 or 2 ticks attach and give a tiny little bit of Theileria to them, and then they get a very small dose and they build up immunity. And then as more ticks attach, as the tickicide wears off, then they build up stronger and stronger immunity. But when you go into a ticky area, it's complete unknown as to how many ticks there are, and if they're in the paddock that the cattle are in. And so there will be a lot of variation. Generally, we tend to think about 3 to 4 months is the time taken for an animal to develop immunity, ideally. but because of variation in the number of ticks, it could be more than a year before they actually have sufficient exposure to develop it.
Thanks, Matt. Does a cow that has recovered go on to be a carrier that can pass it on to somebody else? And if so, is there a blood sample that can show the level in their blood months after infection?
Yeah, there's been some really good studies done in Japan that have shown this. Animals that get infected with Theileria tend to carry it for the rest of their lives. Now, when we say they carry it, it's only in a tiny number of red blood cells, but it does survive. It does actually maintain the infection for the rest of that animal's life. Now, whether it becomes sick again is a matter of how metabolically challenged that animal is. And so when you look at animals that have got a very mild infection, a subclinical infection, and monitor them as they go through challenges like approaching calving, you'll find that the number of infected red blood cells increases and the chance of that animal getting sick increases, and the key time is immediately before calving. So we do know that due to the changes that take place in the animal's body around that time, they aren't able to control or suppress the infection, and that's when they're most likely to get sick.
Thanks, Matt. Is there cross-immunity or cross-protection between the different Theileria species?
Yeah, thanks for that one, Murray. From buffalo to Ikeda. Look, yes, it has been demonstrated, and there's been, again, some great work done at Tick Fever Institute that has already demonstrated that, and that's been published. And there's also some more recent work being done by Professor Emery of University of Sydney that addresses this same issue. And so even though we don't have vaccines, there's an indication that prior infection with buffalo will protect animals against the more serious strains, Ikeda and Chitose.
Thanks. And that question also came through on the chat from James. So good to answer both of them in one hit. And another question that I slipped through on the chat here. Any thoughts why did we see more ticks in drought on livestock in this, I'm going to assume Central Tablelands area, CT area? So Brett, if I've got that wrong, please type in again.
No, that's a puzzle to me, Brett. Yeah, if you saw them during the drought, you're probably going to see more now. I don't know. It's a difficult thing with these ticks. You expect to see ticks on cattle and you don't, and then you don't expect to see them and you do. They're a really mysterious tick. So there is a bit of randomness about when they do appear.
Great, thanks, Matt, and thank you to our audience. And just a little save the date before I let you go. The next webinar for ParaBoss will be Spotlight on Small Brown Stomach Worm. This will be a multi-species approach, so we invite all cattle, sheep and goat producers to attend on the 19th of April, 1 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, and our presenter will be Dr. Paul Nolan. So thank you very much, everybody. And one final slide for new ways of keeping in touch with ParaBoss. You can scan this QR code for a new landing page, and you can join us on Facebook at paraboss.com. You can email us at admin@paraboss.com.au. And also, if you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to our e-newsletter. All the W's at paraboss.com.au/subscription.php. You better get all the news on all our up and coming events, both online and live, from this newsletter. So please join us if you haven't already. So that's it from us today from here at ParaBoss. Megan and myself and Matt, thank you very much for joining us all, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Bye for now.